Okay. Thank you. My name is Steve Boning. I'm here on behalf of Coastal Waterways Design and Engineering LLC, and as Mr. Harpering just indicated, we are responsible for putting together the vulnerability analysis. And yeah, we are checking off boxes. This is task 5, the public outreach number 2. But of course, we're looking to make this as productive as we can. The purpose of this particular meeting is regarding the vulnerability assessment. The Town of Indian River Shores is conducting a town-wide comprehensive vulnerability assessment pursuant to Section 380.093 Florida statutes. As part of this process, the town aims to present findings from the exposure analysis and the sensitivity analysis, which are the two major components of the vulnerability assessment, and the draft vulnerability assessment to a large extent, although now we're moving toward final. This is our last chance to introduce any comments or other elements into the vulnerability assessment as we approach preparations of the final. The meeting purpose is to gather community-specific input from the public on these results, while also reviewing the methodologies and assumptions used in the analysis for potential refinement. We don't expect to do too much refinement at this point in time. We already had some input from the public meeting previously, but again, this is another capture for us to introduce anything if necessary. Additionally, the town seeks feedback on prioritizing focus areas to guide the development of adaptation strategy and projects. In other words, we actually want to do something with this document. We don't want it to sit up on the shelf and get dusty. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we had to perform the vulnerability assessment and some of the benefits that will come forth from that. So first, in terms of the introduction, my name is Steve Boning. Again, I'm a PE licensed in the state of Florida. We're undertaking this on behalf of the town, this vulnerability assessment. I also have Brandon Page with me, who's our GIS expert, who's done a considerable amount of work for the layers underneath that produce the maps and exhibits that we're going to be talking about that we've seen already. So in terms of a vulnerability assessment, we are assessing again the community's vulnerabilities to various scenarios, various adverse impacts associated with storm events to potential sea level rise into the future. It's looking at increase in frequency of storms, which we've seen, and it also looks at duration of rainfall events, although that's not a component that is typically investigated for these coastal communities because there are other scenarios, that we'll see here that have far more impact on a community that's on a coast like this, a barrier island community. We look at storm surge from these more frequent and severe weather systems, and we also are looking at projected sea level rise that's been identified for us by the state, who is paying for this vulnerability assessment. And again, it's because these across the state, the entire state, and even in our communities, pose economic, social, environmental, and public health and safety challenges. And we want to address these effectively by understanding the impacts from these events. So most of us already understand what at-risk is and what being resilient is. Here's an example of a home that happens to be on a coastline that's at risk of erosion and perhaps even sea level rise. On the right-hand side is a home that's built to be resilient against higher waters, higher tides. This looks like it's on an abayment area. Maybe it's an ocean area. I forget where we got that one from. And again, we see communities that were impacted around us. This is Fort Myers, not too long ago, Hurricane Ian, a Gulf community on the coast that was impacted significantly by storm surge, wind impacts as well. And we even see in our area considerable damage associated with storm events, hurricanes. Here's basically resilience among ruin, I guess you can call this. This is a famous Mexico Beach structure. Mexico Beach is in Panama area of Florida Panhandle, and this structure was built to an extremely high standard. I'm not even going to say the high standards that we are normally used to. They went the extra mile for sure, and it obviously, compared to the structures around it, it survived with very little damage. And The home was intact, and unfortunately the infrastructure around them, electricity and utilities were not, so there's a lot to be done with regard to making a community resilient. And then, of course, there's also some good examples of communities that are built here in Florida that are resilient designed. So they're, in this case, in Cape Coral on your left-hand side, the homes are protected from a significant flood event. The roadways are impacted to some degree. And then Babcock Ranch, which is in Lee County, that's designed with the road elevations just or I should say higher than the impact flood that they're anticipating. So again, there are resilient type communities being constructed or being reconstructed throughout the state. So let's get into our assessment and talk about the scenarios examined. First of all, why are we doing this? Well, there's money given to us. 100% of the funding is from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection Coastal Resiliency. They thought it important enough that all the communities in Florida have a vulnerability assessment performed to look at all the flood scenarios or as many of the flood scenarios as possible in order for us to develop in a more resilient manner. So we have resilient planning funding and data collection funding, which we utilized, and then of course the vulnerability assessment. So the studies are meant to determine what impacts you may have so that we can look to see if there's an ability to reduce the impact of flooding and potential future sea level rise. One of the things that the vulnerability assessment is also used for is that the DEP has funding available for future projects for resilient. But if you did not perform your vulnerability assessment, you're not eligible for funding. So it's a huge box to check off to become eligible for future funding through the DEP's Coastal Resilient program. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, and as we move forward is, first of all, what vulnerabilities does Indian River Shores face? And I think we talked about that, we went through that. We were able to, first of all, we had to do scenarios that the state wanted us to do. And we also were able to do scenarios that we were inclined to look at with regard to a storm surge. We looked at a Cat 3 event, for example. So we looked at the vulnerabilities that we thought were most impacted. But we also want to consider what projects that we can think of that resilience is necessary. And the reason we want to have this advanced type of thinking is because if, for example, we say, well, our dunes, for example, or our coastal shoreline is a asset that we want to protect. We want funding for maybe those projects. We want to make sure they're integrated into the vulnerability assessment so that when we do have our application before DEP for a project and they ask us if we have a vulnerability assessment, we say yes. And if they ask us if you assess the vulnerability of this particular asset, we can also say yes. So that's the concept, the idea behind us trying to be forward thinking in what we see as potential projects. Okay, so let's get into the scenarios more in depth. So in general, we looked at a sea level rise, a few scenarios, in fact, of potential sea level rise as dictated to a certain extent by the state. We looked at a high tide event. We also looked at something that's commonly referred to as the 100-year storm event or the 1% storm event. We based that on FEMA flood map, and we're going to come back to that. And then we did a storm surge, a Cat 3 storm surge. So with regard to sea level rise, the NOAA projections that exist at the time included these sea level rise projections out to, I think, like 2100, year 2100. The vulnerability assessments that were required, the grant that we were required to produce under the grant was a 2040 and 2070 result. So now if you go under the vulnerability assessment to get grant funding, you're now needing to look at the 2050 and 2080. We're in a 2040, 2070. So we selected, with guidance from the state, a 2040 intermediate low and a 2040 intermediate high. and then a 2070 intermediate low and a 2070 intermediate high. So if you look at the blues, those are the kind of those are the lows. You look at the yellows or oranges, those are the highs, and then the intermediate is the red. So we took something just a little bit below the red, a little bit above the red for those years, 2040 and 2070. Again, these are projected sea level rise based on current data that NOAA is utilizing. All communities in Florida have to do this. Okay, so here now we're getting into the meat of our assessment. On the left-hand side is what you would see in the reports. Some of you have already looked at our draft report. That's a map. The map comes with tables as well. On the right-hand side is a product that is developed basically from our GIS, right? So we have the GIS layers that are developing the maps that we see that are printed in the book. But we also get this unique product that can be visualized in this, ortho view here. This happens to be the intersection of the Fred Turk Drive and Highway A1A. So you can see there in the light blue in the back is the public safety building, and then the green buildings here is the community center, and then only a portion of this facility that we're in, because for some reason the data that we obtained from the county didn't have this other wing on the structure. So what we're doing here is we're just giving you a map that's in the exhibit, but we're also showing you in this view, because we have this unique ability to do so with the GIS, we're also kind of showing you what it looks like, it's close to real world, as if we were hovering in a drone or something like that over this intersection. So this is a example of the impact of the intermediate low 2070 sea level rise. And in the map you can see very, very faint blue colors that are showing up mostly on the shorelines. And what we're looking at is the depth of flooding. So as you can imagine, the shorelines are low, right? You're at the mean high water line, or you're at the water line, you're at a low. So any flooding there will be high. And that's where you're getting that a little over 3 foot, those dark little spots. If you look at the GIS view to the right-hand side, you can see that in the back there, where there's a low wetland area behind the development, that it's beginning to start to see some impacts. It's almost like a high tide event. But in our community, we're not really seeing any significant flood exposure, we'll call it. Exposure is the extent of flooding. And then sensitivity would be, well, how much is it flooding, right? So, if I'm a public safety and I have these vehicles that are going through the water that can make it through 6 inches of water, a flood in my location is not the issue. Okay, if it's flooding in my location, that's important, but how much is it flooding? Is it 6 inches or 6 feet? That may make a difference in how I respond. So that's kind of the idea between exposure and sensitivity. So these maps on the left-hand side will be our exposure maps. And then the tables that we derive in our reports will show us some of that sensitivity. And again, we'll see both of those things, exposure and sensitivity, on this exhibit to the right, our GIS exhibit, as we scroll through some of these. This is the intermediate high 2070. And if you notice, and I'll just jump back real quick, you can see the map on the left-hand side starts filling in some of the low shoreline areas, and maybe even some upland areas start becoming impacted. So those low shoreline areas that were going to be in about 3 feet of water are now in about 5 feet of water for an intermediate high 2070 sea level rise scenario. And we can see there's some persistent flooding in that back wetland area, and then maybe even some flooding adjacent to some of our structures in some low areas, maybe where there's some retention ponds, et cetera. But again, we're not seeing too much of an impact in our developed areas of our community. Now, we also looked at a high tide event. A high tide event was dictated by NOAA as well, and all these events are additional water that we put on top of our existing water scenario for today. What we actually use is the mean high water, so we're a little conservative, which is an appropriate way to assess this. It's a standard way to assess this. So we are looking at a more conservative, I guess, result, because the difference between like mean sea level and a mean high in our area is about 1/3 of a foot, or yeah, about 1/3 of a foot, I'd say, yeah. So having that extra third of a foot is what we're doing. We're putting on top of the mean high water. So we put this high tide event on top of the mean high water, and we can see that, again, it's not impacting our community very much except for the low-lying areas and the shoreline. But when we take that high tide and we combine it, which was one of the requirements, we ended up doing 12 scenarios here for this assessment, but we combined it with a intermediate high. So it's basically saying, well, if you got a high tide event in the future, when we have a projection of a 2070 sea level rise, intermediate high, if that's to occur, this is the type of flooding that you'll see. And we start seeing that much of our developed island becomes exposed. There's some exposure to some extent. And then we can see again on this exhibit, just as we can see in some of the charts inside the table, we can see the sensitivity, how many feet of water. So in this particular case, with the high tide and the intermediate high sea level rise, in those very, very, very low areas along the shoreline, there's about 9 feet of water now there. And in fact, in this area here, as you can see by the exhibit to the right-hand side, out in front of the public safety building, there's a little over a half a foot of water in the driveway. And out in the center line of that Fred Turk Drive, there's almost 2 feet of water. And then in the parking lot here, if you park your car behind this facility, I guess in the employee parking we'll call it, there's about a little over almost 1.5 feet of water in that parking lot. And then out on A1A, in the center line of A1A, there's almost a half a foot, 0.4 foot in the center line, which again, you could traverse. But in the gutters, there's about 1.5 foot, which means if you're going in and out of maybe a development, that you might be seeing that. So this is kind of giving you a sense that with a high tide, with a future projected intermediate high sea level rise, this could be the potential impact to our community. Now we looked at storm surge. What we ended up taking is the Cat 3 storm surge. This is a modeled elevated water that's due to a incoming Cat 3 storm event. So again, in those low areas, the potential, if the storm hit just right, as modeled, we'll call it, in those low areas, there's now 11 feet of water. And in our community, we have significant exposure. You can see it in the left-hand side. And it ranges in feet. And in fact, when you look at, again, this area of the community where we're in, that driveway in front of the public safety is now looking at 3.2 feet of water. Again, this is a Cat 3 storm surge that could occur anytime. It's modeled for today's world, if you will. It's on a mean high water, so yeah, you would be looking at it on the most extreme high tides that we normally get. And again, Fred Turk's 4 feet of water. Now you're looking at almost 2 feet of water in A1A, the center line, and almost 3 feet of water in the gutter. So, and we know that hurricanes obviously have an impact on our community. What we often don't recognize is the impact it can have on our Back Bay area. So the Atlantic Ocean side is obviously getting impacted, and it's probably a little bit higher storm surge out there. The inlet's going to let water in, and if that storm is around for the modeled time that it was around, as derived by the numerical model, it'll continue to fill that Back Bay up until that storm passes, and then it can go back out again. So this is the storm surge associated with that Cat 3 event. And then this is just, putting a storm on top of another event, another scenario. This is looking at a Cat 3 into the future if indeed the 2070 intermediate high sea level rise were to be, what's projected now were to occur. If you were to put this Cat 3 storm on that, there's additional flooding, as you would imagine. So now we're looking at, on the order of 6 feet of water in this area, and in lots of the parts of our community as well. So again, this is a catastrophic event, no doubt. So we learned a couple things as we proceeded through our analysis. One of the things we looked at is the, and I'm going to come to it in a minute. I just backed this view out, by the way. All I did was just back the drone out, or whatever we're in, the hot air balloon, so that we can look over the beach. And what I wanted to point out, because this was brought up by staff, by public safety, Tad, you had brought this up, is, where are we susceptible to breach in the dune system? And the storm surge What unfortunately it doesn't show, and none of the scenarios that we've talked about so far, they don't show it, is any wave impact or erosion impact, which would really start becoming the issue with regard to the dune. So we back out here and we show the storm surge, and again, the same storm surge we were just looking at, Cat 3, intermediate high, but we know full well that the impact on our coast will have an erosion impact, and we'll have a wave run-up impact with the waves having the momentum, and that run-up could include that overtopping as well as if there's any breaches due to erosion. That's not getting picked up when we look at these storm events. However, after looking at all these apples, we do have one orange we looked at, and that's the 100-year storm event. Again, I use the same scenario. I'm backed out here. But we have somewhat of the same problem here. Well, first of all, we are looking at, in a 1% annual chance storm event. Again, this is today. This is not on a projected rise in sea level or anything like that. But this is the orange to the apples. This is not just storm surge. This is storm surge plus wave. And yes, you're going to have waves even in the back bay. When we do the analysis for like a FEMA map, we're not just elevating the water, we're having to run so we're doing two models. We're elevating with one model, and then we have to run another numerical model with a wave. And if we had another half hour, I could make you all coastal engineers, because waves are depth limited. So if you have 10 feet of water, you're going to have a 8-foot wave. If you have 5 feet of water, you're going to have a 4-foot wave. So in other words, that wave's going to break. That large, 8-foot wave's going to break when it feels 10 foot of water. It's not going to come in any further. It'll rush up with the foam, etc. But the wave breaking energy will be dissipated there. And that's why you have offshore, you see sometimes after a storm or even during a storm, you see waves breaking immediately offshore. The sand has come up. The sand is now making a sandbar, and it's tripping these big waves, almost like the beach is almost protecting itself. So that you're seeing the results of a depth-limited wave. Now, smaller wave's going to come in. It's going to go right over that and come in. So that is that's the orange to the apples. But now we start getting somewhere, because now we're looking at some impacts that, again, are on our dune system. But the study stopped there. And as we talked at our previous meeting internally with some of the staff, is that looking ahead, this may be an opportunity for us to consider this 1% annual chance storm event or 100-year event, perhaps with a sea level rise. But if we're going to do that sea level rise, because of depth-limited waves, we ought to run the FEMA's, they call it WAFIS model, wave model, and erosion on that new scenario. So that's something that we can consider doing, because we ran it in and this is of interest to you, I know, Tad, we ran it in other communities that had the funding and the ability to do it at the time. And on one of the higher scenarios, I think it was the intermediate high, they had a breach in one of their dunes that showed up in it. So it is I guess you could say, a worthy exercise in determining that particular instance or occurrence that could probably happen. And it's a good way, I think, to assess the dune for our purposes of understanding where our weak links are. And I think it also is a good way for us to demonstrate to whomever, DEP in particular, that we analyze it to such a degree that we found maybe a weak link that's going to occur perhaps in the future, but this is what the DEP is having us look at, and then maybe perhaps we could be investigating some funding for that project. And I know there's a lot of funding already available, but vulnerability funding is, there's quite a bit of money out there right now for coastal resilient funding. So maybe there's additional funding in there. Yes, sir.
And Steve, in terms of this model, and we use it as an additional weapon in our continued application to try to get Sector 4 to be recognized as a critically eroded beach by DEP. So far, we've not been successful with that. Do you think this would give us additional ammunition?
That's a good question. The question is, for the sake of recording, is could this information that we're garnering from the vulnerability assessment be utilized to demonstrate to the DEP coastal group that we have a critically eroded beach, or at least toward that fact that we can be assigned a critically eroded beach. And I think the question is a good question. I think the answer always, unfortunately for me, it seems these days to be it depends, because I know they have specific rules about it, but the rules do allow for other information to be introduced that could demonstrate that there's critically eroded. In other words, they have a 25-year storm event that you run with a numerical model, very specific rules, but there's an opening. And I think what that opening allowed us to do is present items like this, where we did an analysis, we utilized either FEMA flood mapping, or maybe we should even use, that's a good point now, maybe we should use, instead of eroding using FEMA model, erode with the DEP model. That might be a way to start demonstrating that, yeah, we're using your model, we're using your methodology, yeah, we're using it for a 100-year event, but still, I think it would go a long way toward demonstrating that we have these weak links and that they are susceptible to damage, and that there ought to be something done to maybe combat that now before things, if things are going in this direction. So it's possible. I think that's a good question, yeah. I think it's a good idea. So yeah, so that's one of the things, and again, and I brought it up because the DEP has indicated that funding is available for updates to vulnerability assessments. I know we haven't even completed this yet, because they're trying to do two things. They're trying to advance it to 2050 and 2080, like I mentioned, but they're also trying to get the GIS schema, which is the stuff underneath, to match up with theirs. So they're promoting updates, and we talked to them a little bit about additional study, and they said that's one way you could do it. If you're going to update it, you can come in and say you have better scientific data, and we did learn a lot from this exercise, that we could perhaps introduce that and do an update to our assessment. So that might be how we can do it as well. Okay, so those are examples of the scenarios. Like I said, there was 12 scenarios as we combined different things. And again, we did learn from that that there could be some additional analysis performed, especially on the coastal side. And I don't want to leave out the lagoon side, because again, if we were to update that numerical model, for example, for FEMA, there is, they analyze transects, they call it, from the ocean side, but they also analyze transects from the Gulf side. So they place wind on top of that water, which generates higher waves, which gives us our BFEs, our base flood elevations. And again, just to finalize that thought, this is the orange to the apples, because those elevations back there that are pretty similar to what we just saw for the Cat 3, this is the top of any wave event. Now, there might not be that many waves or that much wave activity in this location, but my point is when you look at these maps to the left, that's the top of a wave. So it's not the water that you're sitting in until the wave comes, and maybe you're sitting in up to your knee, and all of a sudden a wave comes up to your thigh or your hip. That's what it's measuring, is that top of wave. Which again, going now from a building code perspective, now it's like, okay, well, what are we designing for? What should we be looking at? Looking at the sea level rise and a storm surge is one thing, but if the wave's on top of it, those are some other things that we perhaps want to look at. And of course, we see that in VE zones, as you know, but we also see that in coastal A zones, is that's a wave component. Whether it's an A zone or V zone, it still has a wave component to it. So that's something that, again, could be studied in a little more detail. So the critical assets is the next thing. And again, the idea here was to do an exposure analysis, and you kind of saw the maps that showed the exposure of our community, the extent of flooding. And then the critical assets that we analyzed, we can look at in a little more detail about to what degree, right, the sensitivity. So here's a list of the critically and regionally significant assets. A1A was determined to be a major asset. We have an electrical facility here. We have some lift stations, considerable number of lift stations around the community. There's a cell tower here. We also have a FEMA lot that we conduct our debris management on that site, so it's important to know what the conditions are there. We have our community center, our town hall, public safety building. And then we have our shorelines, both the Atlantic shoreline and the Indian River Lagoon shoreline. So we assess these, again, to include them in this vulnerability assessment, making sure we're checking off boxes, but also determining what is our vulnerability. And then we have the conservation lands, parks, and wetlands also identified and assessed. So again, we don't have time to go through all of the report, I guess 100 and something pages, but we can certainly try and pick some of these and look to see what kind of impacts we're looking at in our community. So this is the types of tables that are going to be inside with the maps of our report. And here we're showing a major roadway impact by hazard. So this is State Road A1A. What we wanted to do is we wanted to identify the number of feet of roadway that's impacted for various storm scenarios. So on the left-hand side, you see the scenarios. We have our, and it's cut off a little bit, I'm sorry about that, but that L2040 is IL, it's intermediate low 2040, then our intermediate high 2040. So these are sea level rise all by themselves. We have a high tide, and then we get down to the purple, we have a high tide plus the intermediate low 2040. So we have the high tide sea level rise scenarios. And then we get to our yellow, which is our Cat 3, and then we get to our green, which is that 100-year flood, and then we have some more of those combined storm events, or scenarios rather, which is the Cat 3 storm on top of the future projected sea level rise. So those are the scenarios there. And then these tables show us what portions are at risk of the highway, how many feet. And we have a low risk assigned, a medium risk, and a high risk assigned. This is what the state wanted us to do for all of these types of analyses. So we had to derive those, and what we came up with is low risk is 6 inches to a foot of water, which most SUVs can get through. So that's kind of like, that's where we had the low risk. Medium risk is 1 to 2 feet, so maybe large lifted vehicles or emergency vehicles can get through. And then high risk is 2 feet or more, which is limited to maybe like the National Guard brings a vehicle down or even a vessel down. So that's kind of like how we assessed our major roadway. So just as an example, this map to the right is associated with that line to the left, which is the intermediate low 2070, and there's no impact. Okay, so A1A is built up high enough that there's no impact to the highway, to A1A from a future projected intermediate low 2070. If we look at a high tide on an intermediate high 2070 in the future, then there's a small 400-foot portion of road at low risk. It's actually outside of Town Hall. I think the H in Town Hall is covering the yellow on the highway, on A1A. So that's only a small stretch that's impacted by that. But as we move up to a Cat 3, we start seeing 250 feet of area is in about a foot of water, but there's 1,500-foot length that's in 1 to 2 feet, and even a 400-foot length right out front here that's in a depth of 2 foot of water. So again, the map's a little hard to see, but most of the colors are and you can see on the page of the actual assessment report, you'll see the colors show up pretty clearly underneath that Town Hall wording. It's a red, red right out here, and then orange on either side, and then yellow. There's a bit of a low area in A1A. And again, just thinking out loud and a little bit ahead, it's like, hey, you know what? Now we have something to tell the state, FDOT. Hey, you know what? In a Cat 3 event, this road, is maybe impassable, or in a future flooding event that may be associated with a future sea level rise, this is a low area. What can we start doing looking at this to maybe mitigate for that? And then again, using the most catastrophic, I think the whole roadway is virtually impacted by a Cat 3 on top of an intermediate high 2070 sometime in the future. So again, you see lots of color on the A1A where those areas of low, high, and medium. And depending on our internal roadway system, this might be something that is of interest to even public safety to know where we go, where can we get around. Again, Cat 3 probably shouldn't be here maybe to begin with. And I'm sure you have your own safety mechanisms of when you go and no go, but this is kind of a good tool to use. And that's another point. If this assessment upon completion, you think that maybe we should have looked at a Cat 2 instead, well, that's something that we can do. Hey, the Cat 3 is very catastrophic, but a Cat 2, we may do something different. What does that look like? Maybe that's something that we can look at running if we decide to do a future update. So here's another example of the tables that are in here. This is a long table. We actually broke it. This is not necessarily a requirement of this particular vulnerability assessment, at least not under the state requirement, but we thought it would be good to at least assess the roadways within the town. And again, all the scenarios now are kind of flipped up top now, the colorization there, the reds, the purples, the yellows. Those are all the scenarios. I flipped them up that way because, again, we had a lot of roadways throughout the community that we wanted to assess. And again, the GIS made it pretty easy for us to make the assessment, and that's what we did here. So you can see it doesn't have the high, medium, low. We didn't, again, go to that extent, but you can see that there's flooding in those roadways from those events. Most of them, as you can tell, are those higher extreme events. If you can see, there's mostly zeros on the left-hand side, and they start getting some, 400 and 700 linear feet of roadway in some cases as you move to the right. So again, that table's in there as well, just for information, and something you could be building upon if we want to. And again, just for pointing it out, there's maps that go with it. There are a limited number of roadways up in the north that are impacted by even a sea level rise event. So that's interesting to see. Nothing really is impacted by our high tide event as far as roadways, and then a few more roads start getting picked up with some of our other types of scenarios here, the high tide plus the future sea level rise. And again, as we start moving, we already know this is the flood zone. If you look at a flood map, you see the roads and development is covered, okay? So this is not a surprise to us when we see flood zones, when we see roads flooded during our 100-year flood or 1% annual chance storm flood event, because it's on the FEMA flood maps that we're all used to seeing. Cat 3 has a large impacts, and then Cat 3, the catastrophic one, is just about every road is flooded. All right, and then we also have some data in here on property impacts, mostly in acres, so percent of our buildings. So here's something that, again, we can take a look at this and then look at our maps and again, get a good idea of what inventory, what is susceptible to what storm events, just in general terms. And then, of course, it just so happens it's in this particular area most of our critical facilities exist. When I say that, I mean most of our public safety, our operations center here. This would probably become an operations center, cell towers in this area. So here we have our critical facilities, and this one again, we identified low, medium, and high risk. We used less than 1 foot of water as a low risk, and then over 1 foot of water, well, actually it's 1 to 3 foot of water as a medium risk, and then over 3 foot of water as a high risk. And the color coding is in the table itself, so you can see the yellows, oranges, and reds. So you can see for different events the various sensitivity to that event. And I think we even color coded the dots, I think, on our map to the right. And this is our lift stations. So this is important to know as well. So there's a number of lift stations we identified through GIS, mapped them, assessed them through different scenarios. And certain things that we need to know. Number one, low risk is less than 2 feet. So what does that mean? That means your wet well is getting filled. Okay, the wet well is already filled with stuff that we flushed down the toilet. But this might be of interest to us because if it's filled with water, what is that stuff that's in there doing? Is it coming out? That kind of thing. Is it causing a safety hazard? So even those low risks might have some interest to us in terms of planning. As we get to a medium risk, it's 2 feet, so we might have some components that are at 2 feet. And certainly high risk, which is over 2 feet, that starts impacting electronics and the telemetry of some of these lift stations. So it's starting to put it at that facility more at risk. And again, if you look at this one, I think we have one identified as, I can't read that number, but it's third one from the bottom. Looks like, anyway, those can be located physically on a map. But that one you can see is already being impacted by some of the more milder events where some of these other lift stations don't start getting impacted until we get to further down the right-hand side of the column. So that might be one that is of interest to us in terms of just from a planning perspective is, what do we want to do with that lift station? Where is it? Why is it susceptible? Is there something we can do? Or is it just in a location that's just low? So again, some practical things that can come out of this. I think that's just more. Oh yeah, this was an example of it associated with a map. So we have maps that are associated with the various storm events. So here's that very condition I was just talking about. Brandon, does that show up there? I guess it shows up in the paper. I just want to make sure we have a correlation to that. Well, we have the code number there, so it'd probably be a matter of just learning the code, the PSL, yeah. I was kind of hoping it just, the bright light shines, like this is it right here. But we can, we can find it, obviously. Okay, so again, as you get to the higher events, we can expect to see, these lift stations becoming more and more impacted. The good news is they're mostly low impacts to these lift stations, which, may be a testament to the design location. They don't start getting impacted until we get to these higher events. Okay, so that information also exists in quite a bit of depth, if you will, in terms of lift station and the impacts to those, with the associated mapping for each of the scenarios. Okay, so that kind of concludes really what we wanted to do in terms of presenting this, and we already had some questions, but certainly we can open up for additional questions. And again, the things that always trying to keep on our mind is making sure that we are capturing the vulnerabilities that you see, or maybe you've seen in your other communities that you lived in the past, or other communities you currently live in elsewhere. Are we looking at those vulnerabilities? And then always think in terms of projects. A road project, it might be A1, it might be the DOT, but can we demonstrate to them, hey guys, did you guys get this on your vulnerability assessment too? Because we're seeing that, we might want to make sure this is an area that we can traverse. One thing that was a little disappointing when we did go through this was that we tried to look at things like the causeways, which sometimes get a little low before you go over those high-rise bridges, because in certain cases we may have events that are small enough events that don't impact us to the degree we want to leave the island, so we might still be here operating. And if we are, it'd be nice to know if, what access do we have, or what access does other communities have to us that we rely on, for mutual assistance. But the DEP turned us down every time we tried to sneak something like that in. So it would behoove us to also look at Indian River County's vulnerability assessment. They're working on it now, so that we're kind of tuned into those things as well, And particularly, I'd like to see, like, again, in terms of mutual assistance, are we relying on a fire station over there that's going to get flooded? Are they looking at that? Those kind of things that we want to always be considering as well. The things that impact our community, that are outside our community. Okay, so we did the risk vulnerability analysis. We started that up, collected our data, performed the methodology. You've now seen the results, and now we're getting into the next phase, resilient projects and potential funding for projects down the line. So again, that's kind of like the map that we have. We're at the point now where we're putting together the final pieces for our final vulnerability assessment. And again, I don't think that's the end of the story. If there is input that and I know a lot of the staff have looked at it, but even the residents or council, if there's input now for us to make sure we have in our final, then we can include that. But all is not lost. There is still opportunities to look at other, like I'll call it again, new scientific or technical data that we can convince the DEP to include in the grant while we update it to the 2050 and 2080, and while we update the schema. So there's still another opportunity. So with that, I'll open it up for discussion or questions or comments. Okay, yeah, I know I think I answered your question, unfortunately not directly. But that was a very good point, and you did prompt us to push for that with DEP, and they did agree that I'm hoping that other coastal communities are looking at it too, because we did an analysis for a local community, and I mean, I don't think we were surprised, but it was neat to see the impact of a future sea level rise on top of the 1% 100-year storm event. It showed an impact to the dune. And then from Public Works, and even code enforcement, or building, if there's anything you guys see in there that needs tweaking or updating, let us know. Even if it's a spelling element, or if you think that there's a future project or a future consideration that we want to make sure you know, I know DEP won't close the door on us, but I never want to give them a chance. So the more we can put in there in terms of our assessment and what we looked at, the better. So always looking for feedback from you on that one. That's it. Anything else? Yes.
Steve, this model, we're going to be, you showed some scenarios in different locations and so forth. Is the model available to the public or just internal to the government? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, the results of the model, the report, are going to be available to the public. But that right-hand side we were showing, which is a very unique, interesting viewport, that's a GIS-developed product that we have that you own because you paid for it. Where we host it, maybe a good question, or how we use it, because you can make it interactive, where you come into a map and scenario. But it would take a lot to do, I know that, but it's something to think about. Yeah.
Obviously, in a short presentation, it'll hit some hot, you got northern end, southern end of town. They're a little bit different. Huge topography, a little bit down around 7-Eleven. Frankly, a model like that, I like to play with a little bit, but this is impressive.
Yeah, but to your point, we even saw the roadways on a very low, scenario, low water scenario in the north area, getting red, becoming flooded. So to your point, yeah, that north area is more susceptible to flooding, it looks like, than other areas. At least that particular scenario.
And unfortunately, we're kind of trapped here, as you point out, we're relying on other potential planning to get across the 510 bridge, and as well as down at the Barber Bridge, 17th Street Bridge. And to your point, my wife and I went to the Florida, they call it Shore and Beach Preservation Association meeting, and they brought up the same point you did. The bridges may not be vulnerable, but the approach.
Yeah.
So you can never get across the bridge because of the approach. So
Yeah.
I think that's something that would be good for us to take a look at in conjunction.
Right, and you know what, we always think about leaving, but there's public safety and emergency response that are trying to get in, and that might be delayed, so good. All right, well, fantastic. That's all I have, so really appreciate you coming in. Make sure you signed in because that's important for our checklist. And then we got a recording, and appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.